Hi. Hello, assalamu alaikum, merhaba, good tag. Welcome to day 2 of the Global Art Forum. Thank you very, very much for coming. My name is Hubert. I'm the commissioner of the forum. It's been put together by a really incredible team that includes our co-directors Ala Yunus and Omar Barada from Art Dubai, Uns Katan and Miriam Buti, and here in Doha, our colleagues at QMA, which include Malak Hassan, and at Qatar Art Center, Maisa Fatou and her wonderful team. Many others have contributed generously in the 6 months or so that we've been putting this together. We're also grateful to the Dubai Culture and Arts Authority and to AFAC, and Ibraz and the Kamal Lazar Foundation are very kindly allowing us to be streamed online and translated live here at the back. The International New York Times is our international media partner. A few words about the Global Art Forum. Over the past few years, the Global Art Forum may have questioned the inherent priority of the middle word in its title, and that word is art. And it may also have banned white leather sofas, but clearly black is okay, because what you are is always a measure of what you definitely don't want to be. And so the forum invokes television discussions from Oprah Winfrey to Michel Foucault. It tries to pay attention to the rhythms of your attention. There are ideas and feelings, and I hope you feel something after you've forgotten everything else. So a few words about this year's edition, which we're calling Meanwhile History. History isn't ultimately the past. It is, in fact, a portrait of the present moment and a manifesto for the future. Here are a few questions that we're throwing out. Is there history without historians, without documentation, without prejudice? The historian E.H. Carr once said that, quote, a historian imagines the past and remembers the future. Eric Hobsbawm, also a great historian, once urged that we wage a protest against forgetting. So, inspired by these sentiments, Meanwhile History imagines a timeline of transformational turning points, many of which have been lost, forgotten, or erased. And this wonderful title has been given to us by Sofia Almeria, who some of you may have heard speak yesterday evening. And indeed, yesterday evening, we time traveled in the Doha's Sheraton Hotel back to the first decade of Qatar's nation building. Over the course of the week, we will continue the time traveling through 778 AH to the first week of September 1920, then to 1955, to 1966, via the short 70s, which includes 4 decades of Kuwait's cultural experiments, Iran's art history that's been exported to Dubai, and also the lesser-known derivative of Pan-Arabism, which is being called Pan-Kafirism. And throughout this journey through time and space and place, we're also thinking about what it means to call something history, whether history is in fact a kind of fiction or a fantasy. So before we begin this afternoon, can I please urge you all to turn your phones to silent? Thank you. And if any of you care to tweet at all, the hashtag that we're using is GAF8, GAF8. Thank you very much. So, a brief introduction to our first session today. We have 2. So, in the Mesopotamian poem that many of you may have heard of, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the eponymous hero is said to have pearl dived from Dilmun, which millennia later became known as Bahrain. So the Gulf was, for a very, very long time, the epicenter for the world's finest pearls. This, however, changed profoundly in the early 20th century. A great period of economic strife ensued. What today we would probably call a crisis. An economic crisis, a social crisis, and indeed perhaps even a historical crisis. So we wanted to look at the story of this crisis across the Gulf. In Dubai, in a few days' time, we'll be continuing this topic with the historian Frauke Herder-Bey, looking in particular at the impact in the area which is now known as the UAE. And so it gives me great pleasure to now introduce the first of these sessions dedicated to the story of pearling's end. So our guests are Hubert Bari. He's based in Doha as the director of the Pearl and Jewellery Museum and has worked on various museum projects during the past 10 years. He was a lecturer for 25 years at the Natural History Museum in Paris and specialized in mineralogy and exhibitions. His book, Pearls, was written for the exhibition that he curated at the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha in 2010. Rolf Killius is an exhibition curator, ethnomusicologist, sound recordist, film producer, editor, and radio journalist. He works in the delivery of music, dance, and other arts events, especially related to the Arabian Gulf and South Asia. Currently, he's the curator of oral and musical cultures at the British Library Qatar Foundation Partnership in London, which is creating the digital content for the Qatar National Library. And last but not least is our host for this session, Sheyma Buali. Sheyma is a London-based independent culture journalist, essayist, and researcher. Previously, she worked for 10 years in a range of roles in TV, film, and documentary production in Boston, Los Angeles, and her native Bahrain. So will you please join in welcoming our guests, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Shimon, for the whole forum and for the nice introduction. I think what we're going to start with today is one of the sort of myths that we want to address is how pearls actually exist. Hubert has a presentation of how pearls are made.
Yes, because before to talk about pearl, we have to understand what we are talking about, and nobody knows exactly what is a pearl, except when the man has to get out the credit card to buy one, or when the women are wearing them. So I brought my oysters to show you this.
I think part of the myth that we're about to disperse here is that the pearl is made of dew or sand.
So this is an oyster. An oyster is a bivalve animal, okay, two shells articulated with a hinge. And when you eat an oyster, usually you kill it just because you open it totally. And then it revealed the inner of the oyster. You have the abductor muscle, which allowed the oyster to open and close. You have different organs. They are the stomach, many things, the liver, etc. And then you have a sort of crescent organ. You eat them when you eat a scallop. It is red in the scallop. It is what we call the coral. And this is the sexual organ. It's important to know this. And all of this is packed into the mantle of the oyster. It is a sort of skin which covers both valves. Okay? So until now it's not really complicated. When an oyster is living, it's living a little bit open and is filtering the water. There is on the mantle, there are some little hair pushing the nutriment direction the mouth, somewhere here, of the oysters. But sometimes you have a little worm coming, swimming, and accidentally swallowed by the oyster. It is not actually worms. Most of the time it is larvae coming from tapeworms evacuated by sharks, stingrays, etc. when they cack. So these tapeworms, they arrive here, they are attracted by the oyster because the oyster is pumping water, filtering water. And so sometimes these tapeworms, they go between the shell and the mantle and they are prisoners there. And then they try to go out. And by going out, they will take with them some cells of this mantle, which will be where they don't have to be. But these cells are building shells, so where they are, these cells will build shell and will build a pearl around the larva. So the formation of a pearl is an accident, biological accident, never provoked by a grain of sand. On 3 million X-ray, I never saw a grain of sand in a pearl. But it is a reaction against, most of the time, a tapeworm larva. So this is how the natural pearls are formed, and it happened very rarely. It's only one, for a good pearl, 1 each 2,000 oysters or something like this. And this is why some people had the idea, oh, the larvae are invading me. And this is why a certain Mr. Mikimoto had the idea, and what's happening is provoke these things by hand. And this is the principle of the cultivated pearl. It is to trigger the formation of pearl by an intervention to displace the cells of the mantle. So to make an artificial, of a cultivated pearl, you open the oyster a little bit, and for the one which will receive the future pearl, and the other one you will open, some others you will open until you find one oyster with a beautiful mother of pearl. And so you suspect that it will make a beautiful pearl as well. And then you take from the mantle of the donor oyster, you take a little square, 2 by 2 millimeter, and you will inject it inside the sexual gonade, because it's a sort of things which is not really useful for the life, the daily life of the oyster. And so you inject this with a scalpel into the gonade, and these cells displaced, but not through the tapeworm, through the hand of a grafting person, these cells will proliferate and make a pearl and form a pearl. And this is the principle. So cultivating pearl, it is a grafting process with a donor oyster, a receiving oyster. But in addition to that, the first Japanese who did this, Mr. Mie and Mr. Nashikawa, they had the idea as well to introduce a little bead cut from a shell, usually from Mississippi freshwater mussels. And this bead, it is not what will provoke the pearl. The bead will just allow the cultivator to gain 2-3 millimeters in diameter immediately, and to induce the sphericity of the pearl. And the pearl is round because the animal is retracting its mantle, opening, retracting, getting out again non-stop, making a sort of belly dancing, which will make the pearl rotating, because the spherical shape is less harmful for the animal. So when this principle has been discovered in 1909 for the first time, 1903, sorry, it was, of course, a big discovery. It took some years more to really realize a good batch of pearls. 1909, they have been presented to the Emperor of Japan. And one of the two inventors, Nishikawa, married the daughter of Mr. Mikimoto. And this is how Mikimoto took the system, the patent, and everything, and started to produce the pearls. Of course, it's not easy to industrialize a process, and we can say that the process is really perfectly organized, successful, starting in 1916, when the first tens of kilograms of pearl started to be shipped everywhere, mostly first in Paris and New York. So the question is this discovery which killed the pearl diving in Qatar and in the Gulf in general? Not really. We just have to do some analysis of the archives, to see that the revenue of the pearl in Bahrain, we don't have this for Qatar, unfortunately, in 1900 is going up, and in the year where are my glasses? Voila. And in the year 1914, you have the big peak of pearl production, which will never be reached again. Why this year? For various reasons. First, the Art Nouveau and the about to appear Art Deco loved pearls very much, so big demand. And secondly, one person, Leonard Rosenthal, a French pearl dealer, could kill the market in Mumbai and to have the pearl directly exported to Europe. A much bigger market opened for the pearls, and it was huge demand for pearls. And so logically, after that, you have the big free fall of the pearl production in the Gulf. Why? Because to reach this point, the divers had to fish enormously numbers of oysters, which couldn't be reproduced on time, and so the next year, depletion of the oyster bank, and it's the beginning of the disaster. But this disaster has nothing to do with the pearl cultivated, because the pearl cultivated started only here, and you see, it was already finished.
Okay,
After that, you have a succession of disaster.
Thank you.
Of course.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, of course, the Wall Street crash in 1929, the Great Depression, and the World War II, and after that it is really finished. It's just anecdotic. So the pearl cultivation is not the reason of this collapsing.
Okay, thanks. That's a really great chart, because the greater markets, both in Europe and the United States, which were it's among the two bigger markets of the pearls, had a lot to do with it, like you said, with the world wars and the depression. But then also there's other parts of the world that had really big markets, and your work, Rolf, has a lot to do with the migratory kind of flows that went both in terms of the people who made the diving crews, as well as the trade routes. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the influences from both the East and India and the West from Africa, as you follow them through your music.
How much time we have today?
We have.
Yeah, that's a huge theme. Maybe I'll show a couple of pictures at the beginning. This is, of course, as everybody knows, the seafront in Doha. And I just bought here from the British Library. This is Doha in the 1950s. It was a little village at that time, and of course, world famous for a landing point of ships from all kinds of countries. And here we have the atmosphere on such a boat, so it looks much less romantic as it's like to be depicted nowadays. I think talking about pearl industry and about people working on the boats, it has to be considered that on one side there was the pearl industry, on the other side the Gulf region was famous for dates as well. So the ships came and picked up pearls and picked up the dates, and in exchange they brought the spices from India to Zanzibar coast, to the Kenyan coast. So I think the whole traffic has to be seen on the sea. Yesterday in the discussion somebody said it's about the exchange of the people along the water, along the sea. And I think if you see it Qatar today, and even today when you see the seafront, I think it's everything is centered to the water, and it was the same in the past. So people went to the ocean and they were connected to the coast in India, in the south in Kerala, in the center in Goa, in Surat, in Gujarat, higher up the center, the big center of pearls, Bombay, now Mumbai. And of course we have to understand that lots of pearls, they were exported to Bombay, and of course the Mughals were famous for buying the pearls, and you can see this wonderful paintings where the Mughal kings were wearing all these necklaces and lots of pearls. So that's where the pearls went, and it was a big business. And of course the people working on the pearl boat, they were involved, but they just got a little share for this.
So can we go back, please, to the picture of the people on the boat? Yeah, I mean, what I also kind of wanted to touch on was the labor conditions of the divers, because this is another sort of, there's a certain romanticization that goes with the pearling era and the history, but actually the labor conditions were really quite grueling. And if we talk a little bit about the way they were paid in the Salafia system, where it meant that they were paid in advance and then had to repay by the quality and amounts of catch that they got, but also the sort of things that the divers were exposed to, which is, you know, the weather and the conditions of the sea, as well as seasickness and sharks, but then also a dilation of heart, ruptured eardrums leading to deafness, a lot of blindness and emphysema, which actually my grandfather as a pearl diver also died of emphysema due to this. So I was hoping that you could maybe touch on a little bit of this history of the labor conditions.
First, going out for pearl fishing, it was difficult. This is a little dhow, and usually on such a little dhow you have 35 people living, yes. Because for one person going down, you have the puller, plus the captain, plus the cook, some fishers, and the apprentice, and so it's big number on a very small surface, living during months together. And to be part of the team, these people, they had to borrow money to leave mostly this money to the family so that they can buy rice, etc., and some date and meat to eat. And they can pay back this loan in money to the captain only after they return back home, and the captain is evaluating the crop of pearl and will share this between the people. So of course he will usually taking one half for him, and only after that the second half is divided between the people. And most of the time, the divers they could not reimburse the captain to pay back the loan, and so they were maintained always in a permanent system of debt. And this was a way to attach the divers to the captain. It is what I call personally slavery. And it was impossible for them to go out of this principle. It is a salafiyat, and it is the explanation of the today's system of hiring people in Qatar, which is called sponsorship. It has the roots in the pearl history.
I think we have to be a little bit careful with the term slavery. Of course, it was well known that people on the boats were slaves, but not everybody was a slave. Especially as I read in Qatar, around most of the people working on a boat were actually Bedouins. They were looking for work on the boats. So they came for the season, for the hot summer season, worked on the boats, and then later they went back and looked after their animals. I think the system on the boat is a typical feudal system. You had the boss, the owner, the landlord, which was the captain. And of course, he was sponsored by some of the traders behind, who again, the captain was dependent on them. And the people were related to the captain on the work on the boat. And people, of course, they had no other possibility than working on the boats. I just came back from Oman last week, and I met a lot of sons of former sailors in Sur in Oman, which was a famous trading point. And they told me that many of their fathers worked on the boat, and it was some of them came from Zanzibar, some of them came from Kenya. Most of them, even today, they are black Omanis. And they said, our background is African, and some of them even speak some Swahili still today. And they were proud of this. But at least they said the poverty was so dire on parts of Africa that some of them jumped the boat in order to escape the poverty. So I think it was a system where I think the boat owners and the people working on the boat, somehow they belonged together. They were chained to each other, you know. It was the only work was from the boats, you know. Maybe at this point we can play some music. I
Yeah.
brought two little films back from Oman, and the sons of the sailors, they actually perform every part of the work on a boat. They perform a certain music and sing and dance, and I was able to film them in Sur. It looks slightly romanticized on the film, but still I think they try to maintain their tradition, and they're very proud to become from this, to still belong to this sailor community.
I'm too big, I will block the image.
Perhaps you. You can talk a little bit about what we're seeing here, like what the influences of this, the dance.
So this is a performance in Doha, and these are in Muscat and in Sur, and people are from Doha, which is again in the south of Oman. And here you have a pair dance, which is clearly derived from European pair dance, but the musical instruments and the rhythms are African. And people they say it still today, we belong to the black Omani community in Oman. And I want to show this because it's also a good example where men and women dance together on the Arabian Peninsula. It's something special.
Okay,
And I
so
have another one.
all right,
Can I play
yeah,
the other one?
it's the sea is a way of connecting cultures and influencing each other's worlds.
I don't know where the other one went. Some clip. That's the clip. So this is the anchor hoisting.
Do you know any kind of background of when this sort of music started to develop?
I think these traditions go at least back 1,000 years. It's very difficult to tell this, but it's definitely something. What people were saying, it's one of the main culture in the Gulf region, and it encompasses Bahrain, Kuwait, in Qatar, on the Omani coast. And I think we can start thinking about it at the 5th century, where people discovered the monsoon winds going from India to the Arabic Gulf, and from the Arabic Gulf back to India. So people were actually able to use the winds of the monsoon to reach the countries in 2 weeks' time. And this, I think it's from this time.
Okay.
This is the rowing of the boat. Oh, sorry. So every part of the work on the boat, as I said before, is accompanied by a certain music, a certain thing. That was the entertainment of the boats. As we heard at the beginning, that people spent 2, 3, 4 weeks on the boat, and this was the nightly and the daily entertainment.
I guess obviously it goes with the rhythms that you have to sort of that go with the rowing of the actual boat. So, but now this is performed more as cultural events rather than seafaring music.
I think it's when we talk about tradition and the Gulf, it's very important that the pearl industry is gone, but we still have the culture, the music is still practiced here, and towards the end maybe of our little discussion, I can show some of the recordings from Qatar as well. The music is still alive, although endangered, but there's still a possibility to show the music, and somehow the music has survived.
Now, before that, though, I mean, something really big happened in the Gulf, which was the discovery of oil. So, we had a kind of our sort of path to urbanization through the seaports and through the trade that was going on in the region. But then we, after that, by about 10, 15 years, or from what we're about to see, is the industrialization because of the oil companies. So you have some Saut music, which is a sort of a 20s style
1920s.
music. Can you tell us a little bit about how that has also to do with the pearling and the seafaring?
Yeah. I was introduced at the beginning that I work for the British Library Qatar Foundation partnership, and I'm the sound curator there. So, and people said, oh, there are some sound recordings in the library which are originally from the Gulf, and there was no cataloging on that. And finally, we discovered that we have around 2,000 recordings, old shellac discs from the 1920s onwards, and we are presently digitizing all of them. And it seems we have around 300 recordings related to Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman. And something interesting happened. I found an old recording of a person called Salim Rashid Suri. He is Omani who left Oman, became a sailor on a boat to India. And he traveled to India, lived in India in the 1930s. And then in Bahrain and Kuwait, and also in Qatar, but mainly in Bahrain and Kuwait because it was much more bigger. First they had this bigger settlement based on the pearl trade, and then successively the oil was discovered in the 1930s. And on top of this, a music culture was developed. So the Saut music was the kind of product of the first entertainer sitting in the cafes and playing the oud and playing the violin and performing different types of drums. And this was something, for the first time, music could be recorded. So people recorded music, and people had, for the first time, a record. And they played it on a thing like gramophone. I don't know who has seen this. And quite often in the cafes, people sat together and played the gramophone, and around the gramophone, people gathered, and they were able to listen to music which was produced somewhere else. And the Saut music, which was a music which was created in the urban centers in Bahrain and in Kuwait and in Qatar as well. And today, I brought a little recording which I have done here in Doha in last November in a little Majlis big performance room of traditional musicians, and they are musicians, all musicians from Qatar, and the singer is from Bahrain. So there's no difference in music from Bahrain and Qatar in the past. And still today, they play together, they perform together, they visit each other, they marry each other. So, Can I play this?
هذا محمد سوي شاي حليب حمر يبقى جنزبيل فيه تسلم يا ابو يوار لا ما شاء الله اشتغلوا بموت تسلم.
Percussion, though, did go on a lot on the boats as well, right? The kind of clapping and the percussion.
I think it's clearly related to the music on the boat, although it's more sophisticated, more urban. The music on the boat was, from the singing, more complicated, but I think the people liked this little ensemble. They introduced the oud. There was no oud, I think. There was no oud in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar before, I don't know, 1890s or something. It was introduced. And of course, it was regarded as a very sophisticated instrument because it's mentioned in old manuscripts. And they were influenced, the first radio station was from Egypt, so they were listening to Egyptian radio station here in the Gulf. And suddenly they discovered we want to create our own music style, and this is the music style which is a mix of Egyptian, Syrian influences, but of course it's typically, from the rhythms, it's typically Bahraini, Qatari or Kuwaiti.
So the discovery of oil, sometime a little bit after this, led to obviously a really big boom in industrialization. But you were mentioning that by then the pearl era, the pearling industry was basically
Yes, it was just anecdotic. But usually you have this error propagated that the pearl went almost to zero production because the oyster beds are gone. But it's not true. The sea is full of oysters today. So why it is not starting again? After with the boom of the oil industry, of course, the salary from this industry was much higher than any diver could make, so it was really difficult. And today, it's really not possible to market a necklace of pearl when now the people know that it represents the killing of probably 50,000 to 100,000 oysters. We are not in the mood today to sell this kind of production, today production. It's not compatible with the way we deal with the planet or with the way we hope to deal with the planet. So the rebirth of the industry is absolutely impossible. And most of the market is based today on existing stock. There is one person, Qatar, Hussein Al-Fardan, who has about 70% of the world's stock of natural pearl undrilled. And the market in jewelry is usually reuse of old jewelry. You take the pearls out of, you dismantle the strand, you mix with other pearls so that you can again sort the pearls according to a beautiful necklace design, etc. This is how it works. And it's a high-end product. And today, a single high-quality Gulf pearl necklace is over $1 million. Yes, I saw an extraordinary necklace last week at the Doha Jewellery Fair by the Al Majed company, and it was stunning. But by all means, because the price is in the region of $10 million. Wow! And the Peregrina pearl from Liz Taylor sold some years ago at $11 million. Two string of the Maharaja of Baroda 2 years ago, $8 million. So now the pearls are becoming something rare and exquisite and more valuable than diamonds, almost. Natural pearls, of course.
Okay.
Is there a difference between natural pearls and cultured pearls? Can you see?
Basically, they are strictly the same, except the triggering natural on one side and provoked by a human intervention on the other. But it's impossible to make a distinction. It is exactly the same, except that in the middle of the pearl you have a little hole which was the tapeworm for the natural, and in the middle of the cultivated you have a sort of phantom which is the piece of mantle you graft and the bead. But today we are grafting 90% of the pearls produced are unbeaded. So even with the X-ray, it's very difficult to make the difference. They are equally beautiful. The more a pearl is beautiful today, the more chance you have to deal with a cultivated one. And yes, all the pearl dealers who say, I can make the difference from here to this table if it is a natural or not. No, I don't believe this at all.
And so the legacy that we have now is more intangible, you would say? Well, it's tangible in terms of the stock that we have, but then intangible in terms of the music that's been left behind.
Yeah, I don't know. I had this wonderful experience the last few months to visit some of the musicians in Qatar and Oman, and I just, from the recordings from the 1970s and 80s, I was so amazed about this highly developed music culture. So I was surprised how this people living on the boat have created such a wonderful music culture, and I was surprised coming to Qatar and not seeing this everywhere, not listening to it everywhere, and I couldn't see anything, you know. People didn't know about it, and people say, oh, there was something in the past, and it was quite difficult to find musicians here who perform still this music. And having been in many parts of the world, I thought this Qatari, Bahraini, and Kuwaiti sea music is extraordinary. It's much more developed than, if I may say, this classical Arabic music. I think it's very extremely sophisticated. People are extremely skilled singing together, and it's amazing music. And my wish would be that this music somehow survives, and people, there should be a kind of renaissance of this music. Maybe the pearl industry is gone, but I would like to have that the culture is maybe still maintained, and I would like that the institution who spring up everywhere here in Doha pick up this idea and talk about that, and maybe propagate it. And also when you come here next door, we have the place where the symphony orchestra, the Philharmonic Orchestra rehearses, and I've seen them performing, and it's really high standard. And there's an Arabic, classical Arabic music institute next door as well, which is fantastic. But where's the Sea Music Institute here in Doha? So I was a bit surprised not to see this, and I just wish people would be interested in that. And I wish especially that young people maybe get trained from the still people who are still around, and maybe towards the end I can play a little bit of it. Or
you are digitizing some of the recordings, so that's
yeah. We the recordings we did last November will be digitized and will be put in this portal in the Qatar.
Older recordings.
We digitize older recordings and new recordings from previous years. We record actually musicians who are still around, and we digitize the old recordings from the 1920s to the 1960s. So everything will be concentrated on a big portal based at the Qatar National Library, and everybody can access it anywhere in the world. So that's something quite nice.
Do we have, I think we might have time for a question. Is that, yeah? Yeah.
Hi, hello. I wanted to ask you, Hubert, it was really fascinating how you began, I guess, dispelling a certain narrative that seems almost universal now, I think. And, you know, the first explanation that comes up when you make a search about the story of pearling is precisely this kind of this narrative of Mikimoto, the artificially cultured pearl, etc. You know, why do you think that narrative has been disseminated and taken up so widely, if with the kind of proof that you showed us that this simply isn't the case? What propagated that, do you think?
You know, the history, when it is spectacular, like an activity as pearling or as a battle or whatsoever, it finishes always with the concept of heroes. Divers were heroes, even if they were very, very poor heroes. But they are now heroes. They were not heroes, they were just people who tried to find some money to eat. And this was the only possible activity in the Gulf. And we made, after the collapsing of the industry, we made with them, we made the hero of the nation, and we have to pay an homage to them. What is true, they were really incredible people, but it is a logic evolution. And so everything which is against this tendency of history is demolished by wrong arguments. You need to find somebody guilty for the extinction of the pearl diving activity. And of course, Mikimoto is a good person to expose in the middle of the public square, yes. And the anti-hero, yes. Can you imagine? He gave the possibility for every woman around the planet to have a pearl necklace around the neck. So it's barbarian.
That's interesting because I guess, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of our sub-themes is historiography, and of course the fact that there's never any monolithic history, always plural histories, of course. But one of the cliches is that history is written by the victors. In this case, you would then assume if Mikimoto and the Japanese were the victors, that they would have been, that they were the authors of this history. But you seem to be suggesting otherwise.
Yes,
that actually in this case, to put it crudely, the losers were the ones writing this particular version of history.
Yes. But they lose because, yes, overfishing, as I said, and because of several disasters around the planet, in crisis, etc. So they are the losers, but not the guilty ones.
And so just one last thing, I was wondering what, if any, kind of relationship did Japan have to the Gulf during this period, politically or diplomatically? Were there trade relations? Were there or certain forms of diplomatic relations?
There is one relation. I don't know about diplomacy, etc. But there is one relation nobody knows, and it's quite important to say. It is that the oyster producing most of the pearls in Qatar, Pinctada radiata, is the same oyster used by Mikimoto to do his crafting and culturing process, except that they are a little bit bigger, but it is the same species. So actually we could do easily, it could be possible to do pearl cultivation with the Qatari oysters, for example. There is a farm in Ras Al Khaimah, and there is a project to build a farm with Tahiti oyster pearls as well in Qatar. Because this is quite strange as well, we have relation with Tahiti here. The Tahiti oyster is living naturally in the Gulf waters as well. And in the Qatar National Museum, there is a collection of spectacular natural gray pearls. It's really unbelievable from Qatar.
Yeah, I have a question in this regard. First of all, I'm learning something I've never heard before, so super interesting. The cultivation of pearls is obviously would be possible here as well. So it could be picked up as a business, I would think. And I'm wondering why not, with a history available. I have once read about an Australian pearl producer that produces on demand certain shapes, so you can request, you tell me how he does it. But obviously there could be expansion in the pearl production way as well, maybe creating an exclusive pearl specific to Qatar. Is there patenting laws prohibiting doing this, or why is it not existing?
The ban against cultivated pearl is still valid in Bahrain, but not in Qatar. You can buy and sell cultivated pearls in this country, but not in Bahrain. The ban is still valid. But of course, it could be possible to cultivate pearl as well, but it's not an easy task. It's extremely complicated, and the instability of the environment today, global warming, etc., makes the accident very probable. It's already difficult enough now in Australia, etc. It's and imagine here you have to buy urgently some medicine against an infection of oysters. You don't have time to fill 200 pieces of papers with the customs. Your oyster will be dead a day after. You have to hire a jet to get the medicine here. This is how it works. And this is not compatible really with the administration today in this part of the world.
Okay, I think, do we have time for another question? Yeah? Does anybody else have a question? Okay.
Very interesting. I was interested in what you were saying about the importance of maintaining the intangible traditions that went along with pearl diving. But I just wondered your thoughts on the resurgence recently of things like pearl diving competitions. So the kind of actual practice of pearl diving, which we've seen in Qatar, and I think there are examples in Abu Dhabi as well.
The Qatar Museum Authority has different activities to maintain the tradition and to save them. So first, recording a certain numbers of documents, etc., thanks to you for the future National Museum. On my side, I'm building a collection of pearl jewelry. Now the span is from the Roman time until today with Qatari, with Gulf pearls. We cannot say if they are from Qatar. We can say that they are from the Gulf. And so the collection will be revealed as well in the future National Museum. It will be a huge surprise. And as well, we are documenting all the sorts of research on pearls. And not only the pearl from here, but pearls worldwide, because any shell can be infected by a tapeworm, and so any shell can make pearls, including the snail the French people, like me, are eating. Yes, the escargot de Bourgogne are making pearls. It's the most exquisite pearl by rarity, but it's 1 millimeter for the biggest we found. But you have as well pearl like this from the giant clam, etc. It's a fascinating world. And so the natural history of pearl is as well something on which we work a lot, and all of this will be revealed in some years from now.
I know that in Bahrain, to answer your question also, there are private companies that take people diving trips, and there are a few that encourage people to pick pearls. So I have friends who've gone on these trips and they'll actually find pearls and they get to keep them. And apparently it's because it helps, it actually helps the oyster beds to pick the oysters. Is that?
I don't know.
No.
I don't know. But I forgot as well, Qatar Museum Authority. We maintain as well the fabulous collection of pearling dhows. You can see them in the park of the Museum of Islamic Art. It is a big work to maintain them and to save the tradition of building them as well. So this is our activities in this field.
I think the question was very much about intangible culture, and of course I think the museums here in Doha, they very much collect objects and show objects, and you were asking about the actual traditions that people can maintain a certain tradition. I think there are certain there's a certain way that young people come together and go in a boat, and then they enact the kind of sailing and walking on the boat and diving and all this, which is a bit cheesy, but I think from the musical side and the dance, there's definitely something what is preserved from the sailors, and it's still alive. But I think these performances are separate from the tourist performances or showcase performance, because it's still done by musicians in their private gatherings. Maybe there should be an opportunity to offer these musicians a forum that they can perform on a stage. So maybe changing it to an art stage, but still maintaining their style.
Is there any other questions?
I just want to add comment to the lady to answer her. There is a lot of programs we do with Rayan channel that involving the youth with the pearl diver. There is 2 special programs for pearl divers that we take like a lot of students from the secondary school. We take them to the Herat, it's where the spot of where we do bird diving, traditional bird diving. So there is a lot of activity happening, especially with the Rayan channel and safe culture, that implement or actually focus with the youth regard oral history, regard the bird diving. I just want to highlight that.
Sure.
Thanks.
You talked about how music came from pearl diving, but were there any other cultural traditions that came from pearl diving?
Sorry, I didn't understand that. Sorry.
Did any other cultural traditions other than music come from pearl diving?
I think there's definitely, what I said before, the urban music is definitely based on pearl diving. But otherwise, I would say they have maintained their culture. It's a very sophisticated culture, and they are still performing, at least in countries like Oman and Bahrain, and a little bit in Qatar as well. So I think it's maintained, and it's going on. I think it's still alive.
she
I think the question was
feel,
whether there were other
if there's other music.
There is a poetry. Poetry is there are, especially in the Sufi poetry, there are beautiful texts on pearl diving. The act to dive in the Sufi poetry in general is considered as an act, because it's so dangerous, to go as close as you can to God. And this, of course, it's Sufi, so it's a bit difficult to understand, but there are beautiful, beautiful texts about the act of diving. And there was a big tradition of poetry from the Red Sea to here.
Okay. Is there any other questions among the audience? No?
Have you translated any of the lyrics from the music that they're singing? And is there anywhere that I can see it?
The lyrics, what I come across is some of them are prayers. They pray to Allah to ask for support in their diving and their work on the boats. Some of them are classical Arabic poetry, where they used for the pearl diving. And some of the music it's not from the pearl diver themselves, but it's from the wives and daughters of the pearl divers who stay at home. So they ask God to support that their sons, brothers come back from the side. I think that's a very important genre which should be recorded, because women have created this music. They sing it at the weddings sometimes, and it was usually performed in the villages behind. And I think I didn't come across a recording of that. That would be something to be done. I think that's very important. It's usually in vernacular Arabic from the Gulf area. It's not High Arabic. I think that's something special.
Yeah, the women had a lot of very particular styles, because the trips were 4 to 6 months at a time. They were entire seasons. So there was a lot of seeing off music from the women as well, right? Is there anybody else with questions? Yes.
Is there any evidence that pearls were traded on the East African Swahili coast in the city-states there? Because I hear a lot about pearls making their way to Europe and to India and Asia, but there's not much mention of the Swahili coast. Is there any archaeological evidence of the historic trade there?
So that they come over to
From Gulf to the east.
I can't answer this question, because I know there's influences. Zanzibar was part of Oman until recently. I think there's definitely influence, and I know people who have researched in that, but I can't answer the question. But it does definitely is an influence.
Can I ask maybe the last question, which goes back to the period of transition from the death of pearling industry and then the birth of oil or gas industry, energy industries. And of course, these dates are different in different countries. Bahrain is 1932. I think in Qatar, it's really not until after, although it's discovered in 1940, it's not until after World War II 45. That oil is exported. In the UAE, it's much later, it's 62, Dubai, 68. So that it's a long period. And I just wondered whether the men who were working as pearlers, do we have evidence, are there histories as to whether or not, when the opportunities arose, did they go into the oil industry immediately, or was the birth of the energy industry the point where I guess a lot of non-Gulf migrant labor began to come in? Because to tie this, I guess, to our discussion yesterday, which is about 72 to 82, which is the beginning of the great period of building here. Of course, the construction industry in the region could only operate at the speed that it needed to by multiplying its labor force through bringing migrant labor in from outside. So I'm just wondering what the history of the shift of industry and the labor force, the indigenous labor force is.
I was recently, as I said before, in Sur, where there's the last shipbuilding workshop in Oman, in Sur. And I was asking who are the people who are building the ship nowadays. They are actually built for Qatar. They have just two big dhows there. And they said a lot of the sailors, they became carpenter later on. They worked they worked themselves up as carpenter. And I had the chance to visit a very old man. He's now nearly 80. And he told me when he was 10, he joined the boat. He went on a boat and became a sailor. And he's now the master carpenter. He's just retired now. And then I went to the workshop and was looking for myself, what's happening on the workshop. And then they said, oh, the Omanis, they have now left for different jobs just recently. The last Omani is, I think, is an engineer, and the rest of the people are Malayalis, people from Kerala in South India. And the experts are now the Indians. And I think it was a gradual process that many people, for instance, they looked a job for elsewhere. But I think carpentry was one of the jobs they took over. But maybe, I don't know, maybe it was a gradual process over a long time of the years when you see 1920s up to the 1960s.
Yes. But for Qatar, we have some data. They are published in this book, essential book, Sea of Pearl by Rob Carter, for the people who don't know it. It's really super book. And he details, gives details about the fate of the people in Qatar after the Pearl crash. And he is speaking about starvation, people dying from hunger, and a substantial reduction of the population. People left the country because it's, as you said, it's only after World War II that the oil industry started to provide a new job in this part of the Gulf, yes. So it was quite difficult. There are as well archives telling the story of riots from the pearl divers in the year 30s. Riots mostly against the food store, of course, to get rice and something to eat.
There was a lot of uprisings of protests and riots in Bahrain as well, pretty much every decade from 1919. And they were against the exploitative system that was going on, but then sometimes they were also about the reforms. Because, like, going back earlier, like there was the idea of the cultivated pearls was completely not allowed, and then eventually when they wanted to modernize the equipment, that was also not allowed because it was more natural to do it without modern equipment, so that made the value of the pearls higher, which then also feeds back into the exploitation and all of that. But so there was a series of uprisings, and the last one that I ever read about was actually in 1936. So by then oil was discovered. Within, I would say, by the early 50s, Babco in Bahrain was built, and it was fully, there was a full, labor force there. So there was a definite shift because nobody, being a pearl diver, it paid the bills maybe just enough. So nobody really wanted to be there. I mean, I can't say nobody, but it was much better, more lucrative job to go and work on solid ground in a much safer environment where you actually get paid a salary, much more modern. And so definitely, yeah, the oil industry did shift the labor kind of force. Yeah. So, okay, thank you all so very much, and thank you both. If you want to,
can I play the last
real
we
Pearl
can
Diver
have
song
from Qatar?
our own seeing off music. Thank you so much, Hubert Bari and Rolf Killius.
Please join me in thanking Sheyma, Hubert, and
Thank you.